The wind doesn't warn you in Dust Haven. It doesn't whisper or sigh or carry the sweet smell of rain the way wind does in other places. In Dust Haven, the wind arrives like a judgment, dry, hot, and absolute. It tears through the gaps between wooden buildings, rattles the iron sign above the saloon, and sends tumbleweeds rolling through the main street like they're trying to escape something they don't have a name for. Most people in Dust Haven had learned to ignore the wind. What they had not learned to ignore, what they could not ignore no matter how hard they tried, was the man who lived at the edge of town, in the old stone house with the black door. Nobody remembered when he arrived. That was the first strange thing about him. You'd think a town of 240 souls would remember the day a stranger moved into the most isolated house on the bluff overlooking the valley. You'd think someone would have a story. I was buying flour when I saw him ride in, or my father told me he came during the drought of '73. But nobody had that story. He was simply there, as permanent and unexplained as the rock formations outside of town, as the dry creek bed that hadn't run with water in living memory. His name, as far as anyone in Dust Haven knew, was Cale. Just Cale, no last name offered, no last name asked for. In a frontier town, you learned quickly that some men arrived carrying their past like a stone tied around their neck, and that stone was their business alone. You didn't ask about it. You didn't poke at it. You smiled, you nodded, you sold them whatever they needed, and you thanked God they hadn't decided to make your town their problem. Cale had never made Dust Haven his problem. That was the second strange thing, because in every story, in every legend that the old-timers swapped over their whiskey and their cards, men like Cale always made things a problem eventually. Men who wore their gun the way Cale wore his, low on the hip, tied down with a narrow strip of rawhide, the leather of the holster worn smooth and dark from 10,000 practiced draws. Those men always had a reckoning coming. Always. It was the law of the frontier as sure as gravity. A man like that either met his judgment or he became someone else's. But Cale just lived. He came into town twice a month on the 1st and the 15th. He bought the same things every time. Dried beans, coffee, salt, a small block of hard cheese, 2 tins of peaches, and a single bottle of whiskey. He never spoke more than 5 words. He paid in exact coin, always exact, as though he'd counted it out the night before, which he probably had. He left immediately after purchasing his supplies, riding back up the bluff on a horse so black it looked like a hole cut in the world. Nobody tried to talk to him. Not after the first year. In the first year, people tried. Of course they tried. Tom Ellery, who ran the general store, tried to chat him up about the weather, about cattle prices, about whether Cale had heard that the railroad survey crew had come through the valley. Cale had looked at Tom with eyes the color of bleached driftwood, gray, pale, utterly still, and said nothing, not a nod, not a shrug, just that gaze steady and empty, until Tom had found something urgent to do at the other end of the counter. Reverend Marsh had tried too. He'd met Cale on the street one Sunday morning, Bible tucked under his arm, and had offered the sort of cheerful, non-threatening greeting that ministers deployed like tools. "Fine morning, friend. I don't believe I've seen you at services." Cale had looked at the Reverend with those colorless eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he'd walked past without a single syllable. The Reverend had gone home, sat in his kitchen for a long time, and poured himself a cup of something that was not tea. After the first year, Dust Haven simply organized itself around Cale. Around his absence, really. Around the 2 days a month when his presence was unavoidable. On those days, mothers kept their children inside. Men found reasons to be at the far end of the street. Sheriff Dale Probst would find a window with a good sight line and watch. Not because he thought Cale was going to do anything, but because watching him was the kind of nervous habit you developed when you'd heard the stories. And there were stories. God, were there stories? The stories had started arriving in Dust Haven, maybe 3 years after Cale did, trickling in like water finding cracks in stone. A cattle drover named Hicks had come through from the south and lingered at the saloon long enough to mention, almost casually, that there was a man in these parts who matched the description of someone he'd heard about down in the territories. A gunfighter. Not a bounty hunter, not a marshal, not a soldier. A gunfighter, pure and simple. A man who had hired himself out to the highest bidder in the years after the war, when the territories were wild and the law was thin, and men with guns and no conscience could make themselves rich if they were willing to do what needed doing. They called him the Silence, Hicks had said, swirling his drink, on account of he never said a word before he drew. Most gunfighters, they want you to know it's coming. They want the moment. This one, nothing. You'd be standing there thinking everything was fine, and then you weren't standing anymore. Someone at the bar had asked how many men the Silence had killed. Hicks had looked at his drink for a long moment. I heard 11. I heard 30. I heard once from a man who'd been there that he killed 5 men in one afternoon and ate his supper the same night without so much as a trembling hand. He'd shaken his head. I don't know the true number. I'm not sure anyone does. I'm not sure he does. After that, the stories had bred in Dusthaven the way stories do, multiplying with each telling, growing darker and more baroque with every winter. By the time 10 years had passed, Cale had been transformed, in the collective imagination of the town, into something barely human. A ghost story, a lesson parents told their children about the wages of violence. He had killed, depending on who was telling it, somewhere between 15 and 100 men. He had burned a town in the territories. He had ridden for a cattle baron who'd massacred a family of homesteaders. He had done things that no decent person would speak aloud. None of it had ever been confirmed. None of it had ever been denied. Cale simply existed, silent and apart, up on his bluff with his black horse and his black door, and Dusthaven feared him the way people fear the dark. Not because of what it contains, necessarily, but because of what it might. And so things stood, until the morning that Nora Calloway knocked on the black door. Nora Calloway was 31 years old, a widow of 4 years, and the owner of the only functioning well on the eastern side of Dusthaven's valley. She was not a large woman, but she had the kind of presence that had nothing to do with size. The kind of presence built from years of hard work and harder decisions, from burying a husband and raising a daughter alone in a place that offered beauty in abundance and mercy in very small amounts. She had dark brown hair going silver at the temples, hands that were permanently calloused from the well crank in the garden, and green eyes that people sometimes found unnerving because they had the quality of looking at you and actually seeing whatever was there. She was not afraid of Cale. That was not. She would have told you because she was brave. She had been afraid of plenty of things in her life. She had been afraid the night her husband Marcus had started coughing blood and hadn't stopped for 3 days until he died. She had been afraid when the fever had come through and taken half the children in town, and she'd spent 2 weeks pressing cold cloths to her daughter, Lily's forehead, and bargaining with whatever power might be listening. She had been afraid the night 3 men had ridden up to her property line and shouted that a widow woman with a good well had no business being a widow woman with a good well. She knew how to be afraid. Fear was reasonable. Fear was information. What she did not have was the particular kind of fear that Dusthaven reserved for Cale, the superstitious, story-fed, collective terror that had turned a quiet, solitary man into a monster in the town's imagination. She had watched this process happen, had seen the stories get bigger and darker with each winter, and had thought, with the pragmatic clarity that had carried her through every difficult thing in her life, that it was mostly nonsense. Men who killed without conscience didn't retire to stone houses on bluffs. They got killed, or they kept killing. The absence of violence from Cale's life in Dusthaven wasn't proof of suppressed violence. It was evidence of something else entirely, she didn't know what. But something else. She'd had this thought for years. She'd never acted on it, because there had been no reason to. Then the drought came. The drought of 1887 arrived in Dusthaven without ceremony, the way all the worst things arrive. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a gradual, insidious subtraction. First the creek ran low, then the smaller wells went dry, then the cattle started showing their ribs, then the dust started coming. Not the occasional dust of a dry summer, but the dense, choking clouds that turned noon into twilight and left a gritty film over everything you owned, everything you ate, everything you breathed. By August, 3 families had already packed their wagons and left. By September, people had stopped pretending that the rains were coming soon. The water situation in Dusthaven had always been held together by a fragile web of wells, the creek, and the cisterns that the more prudent homesteaders had built over the years. That web was collapsing. The creek was gone. The cisterns were running out. Most of the wells were either dry or brackish now. Nora's well was not. Her well had been dug deep by Marcus the year before he died, into an underground source that ran cold and sweet no matter what the sky was doing above. It was. As drought settled over the valley like a death sentence, the most valuable thing in the eastern part of the county. And someone had noticed. His name was Burrell Crane. Burrell Crane was not a local man. He'd arrived in the valley 2 years ago with money enough to buy land, and confidence enough to act as though he'd already bought everything else. He ran cattle on 500 acres, employed 7 men who all wore their guns in a way that suggested the cattle weren't always their primary concern, and had a smile that was wide and warm and never reached his eyes. He wanted Nora's well. He'd started by offering to buy it, not the land around it, just the water rights. A reasonable offer on paper. Nora had declined. She had a daughter, a garden, animals, and neighbors who'd come to depend on the water she shared freely. She wasn't going to sell the thing that kept them all alive. Crane had smiled his warm smile and said he understood completely. 3 days later, one of his men had ridden up to the property line and let 2 rifle shots go into the air, just to see who was home. The message was clear enough. A week after that, someone had poisoned Nora's dog. The dog, a big, gentle shepherd mix named Porter, had been Marcus's dog first, and then Lily's, and then just the family's. And he'd been found one morning lying still in the yard with the particular stillness of something that wasn't going to be still and then get back up. Lily was 11 years old. She'd held Porter's big head in her lap and cried in the way that children cry when they first understand that the world contains deliberate cruelty, and Nora had held her daughter and felt something harden in her chest like cooling iron. She'd gone to Sheriff Probst. Probst was a decent man who knew exactly how decent he could afford to be in a frontier town, without independent means and without a deputy who didn't have his own opinions about Burrell Crane. He'd listened to Nora with genuine sympathy, taken notes in his ledger, and explained that, without evidence directly linking Crane to the poisoning, there was very little legally he could do. He'd said it looking at the middle distance rather than at her face, which told her everything about how much he believed in what he was saying. She'd gone home. She'd sat in her kitchen in the dark for a long time. She'd thought about her options. And then she'd thought about the man on the bluff. She told nobody she was going. She told Lily she was going to check the fence line on the north pasture, which was true. The fence did need checking, and she'd saddled her brown mare and ridden out in the cool of the September morning, and instead of turning north at the fork, she'd turned east, toward the bluff. The road up to Cale's house was barely a road. More of a suggestion, 2 tire tracks pressed into the pale earth by a decade of occasional use, flanked by dry scrub and the occasional twisted juniper. The mare didn't love it, picking her way with the careful displeasure of an animal that knows where she's going and has reservations about it. Nora didn't have reservations. Or she had them and had decided they didn't matter, which was effectively the same thing. The house was exactly as people described it. Stone walls the color of old bone, a roof of dark timber that had weathered to near black, and a door that was painted, or had been painted, in some distant past, the deep black of coal. There was a garden on the south side which surprised her. Not a decorative garden, a working one, rows of something green and sturdy that she thought might be kale, some woody herbs, the remains of a summer vegetable plot. Evidence of someone who intended to stay. Evidence of someone who ate. The black horse was in a small corral to the north, watching her approach with the large, calm intelligence of a well-kept animal. She dismounted at the gate, tied her mare to the post, walked up the path which was swept clean of the dust that covered everything else, and raised her hand and knocked on the black door. 3 knocks. Solid. Neither timid nor aggressive. Silence. She waited. More silence. The kind of silence that had a weight to it, that told her someone was on the other side of it. She knocked again on. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, in the same tone she used when talking to spooked horses. "My name is Nora Calloway. I have a situation and I'd like to discuss it with you. You can say no. I'll leave if you tell me to leave." A pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened. Cale was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she'd expected. The stories had painted him in such broad, dark strokes that the reality of him was jarring in its ordinariness. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, lean in the way of men who work and don't sit still, with dark hair going gray at the temples and that face she'd seen from a distance 100 times. Angular, weather-carved, the face of a man who'd spent years in open country. He was wearing a plain shirt and work pants, no gun belt, and he was holding a cup of coffee in one hand like she'd interrupted his morning. His eyes were exactly as described. Gray and pale and still, he looked at her. He didn't speak. "I appreciate you opening the door," she said. "May I come in? What I have to say will take a few minutes and I'd rather not say it to the doorframe." A long moment. Those gray eyes moving over her face with a careful attention that wasn't hostile, more like a man reading something in a language he'd nearly forgotten. Then he stepped back from the door. She took that as an invitation and walked in. The interior of the house was one large room divided by purpose rather than walls. Near the door, a table and 2 chairs. Against the far wall, a narrow bed made with military precision, a stone fireplace, unlit but clean, a shelf of books, actual books, more of them than she'd expected, their spines dark with handling, a cooking area. Everything was spare and functional and scrupulously clean, and the whole place had the particular quality of a space occupied by someone who had made deliberate decisions about what they needed and had stopped needing anything else. On the table was the cup of coffee, a book left open and face down, and she noticed this and filed it away. A piece of wood and a carving knife. He'd been carving something. She couldn't see what. He sat down at the table and looked at her. She sat in the other chair without asking permission. "I'm going to tell you a situation," she said, "and then I'm going to ask you something. You can tell me to leave at any point, and I will leave without argument. I'm not here to threaten you or to bribe you or to pretend I know anything about who you are or what you've done. I'm here because I have a problem and you might be the only person who can help with it, and I believe in being direct." He said nothing, but he was listening. She could feel it. The quality of his attention, focused and complete, the way some people listen and most people don't. She told him about the well, about Crane, about the men on the property line and the rifle shots and Porter. She told him about her daughter. She told him about Probst and the ledger and the middle distance. She told him about the families leaving, and the ones who couldn't leave, and the dry wells and what the water meant. She spoke for perhaps 10 minutes without interruption, clearly and without drama, and when she'd finished, she sat in the silence for a moment and then said, "I'm not asking you to kill anyone. I want to be very clear about that. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to be seen, to ride down with me or to come into town on a day that isn't the 1st or the 15th, and to let Burrell Crane's men see you in proximity to my property. I think that might be enough." She paused. "I know what they say about you in town. I don't know how much of it is true. What I know is that the stories, true or not, have a power, and right now Crane is counting on the fact that a widow woman with a well has nobody to stand beside her. I'm asking if you'd be willing to stand there. That's all." Silence. Cale looked at his coffee cup, looked at the wall, looked back at her. She waited because she was good at waiting. He said, in a voice rough with disuse, like a hinge long unopened, "Why me?" It wasn't quite a question, more of a test to see what she'd say. "Because you're here," she said, "and because I think you're not what they say you are, not entirely. And because," she paused, chose honesty over tact, "because a man who plants kale and carves wood and keeps his floor swept is not a man who has given up on the idea of ordinary things being worth something." Something moved in his face. Not much. A slight shift, like deep water disturbed by something passing far below the surface. He looked at her for a long time, then he said, "Tell me about Crane." She told him everything she knew and everything she suspected, and as she talked she watched him listen, and she noticed things about the way he listened that she'd never seen before in anyone. The absolute stillness, the total focus, the way he occasionally asked a question. Short, precise questions, the kind that cut straight to the structural weight-bearing elements of a situation, and then went back to stillness while she answered. They talked for 2 hours. 2 hours, which was, she would reflect on this later, almost certainly more words than Cale had exchanged with another human being in the entire previous year. When they were done, he poured her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. She accepted it. It was very good coffee, black and strong. "I'll come down tomorrow morning," he said, "early, before town wakes up. That's—" She started. "I'll ride the perimeter of your property." His voice was still rough, still disused, but it had found a rhythm now, however halting. "Let the tracks be seen. If Crane has men watching, and he does, they'll report back." He looked at the table. "After that, we'll see what he does." "Thank you," she said. He looked up at her then, and there was something in those gray eyes that she hadn't expected to find there. Not warmth, exactly, but the possibility of it. A door not closed. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Not an accusation. More like a man noting a weather anomaly. "I didn't say that," she said. "I said I had a situation. Fear and common sense aren't the same thing." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps. The memory of what a smile used to feel like. She left when the coffee was done, and rode back down the bluff, and felt, for the first time in weeks, like the ground under her was something she could stand on. He came at dawn, as he said he would. She heard the horse first, the soft percussion of hooves on dry earth, and went to the window and saw him riding the fence line to the north, moving slowly, letting himself be seen. The black horse against the pale morning light. The man sitting straight in the saddle with that quality he had of absolute stillness, even in motion. She watched from the window and felt something she hadn't felt since Marcus died. The strange warmth of not being alone. She went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. Crane's men saw him. Of course they did. By noon, the word had reached the saloons. By mid-afternoon, it had reached Crane himself at his spread 5 miles east. By evening, a rider had gone out to some destination that nobody would admit to knowing, carrying a message that nobody would admit to knowing the contents of. The next morning, Nora's property line was quiet. The morning after that, too. On the third day, she rode up to the bluff again, not because there was a specific reason to, but because. She was honest with herself about this. She wanted to. He opened the door before she knocked. She stood in the doorway and said, "It's quieter." "Yes," he said. "Do you think it'll hold?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "For now. Crane isn't stupid. He'll wait to see if I'm actually involved or just making an appearance." "And are you," she asked, "actually involved?" A pause. Those gray eyes steady on her face. "I'm making coffee," he said. "Come in." What happened next happened the way the most important things in life happen. Not in dramatic moments, not in declarations, but in accumulated small ones. In cups of coffee shared while a September morning turned warm outside. In conversations that began with logistics and ended, almost without anyone deciding to go there, somewhere more honest and more real. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a landscape by walking it rather than looking at it from a distance. He had grown up in Virginia, the son of a schoolteacher who died in the war, and a mother who died of grief 2 years after. He had been 17 when he'd first hired his gun. Not because he had no conscience, she came to understand, but because he'd had no other options in a world that was burning and starving, and had decided that a boy who could shoot with inhuman accuracy was a commodity rather than a person. He had done things he couldn't make right. He had stopped doing them when he was 30 after a job in the territories that he described only obliquely in a handful of sentences on a cold October evening. And she understood from what he didn't say that whatever had happened in those territories had been the thing that broke whatever part of him had been willing to keep going. He had ridden north and east and found the stone house on the bluff, and he had stopped. "Stopped everything?" she asked. "Stopped everything," he said. "Except living." He looked at his hands. They were large hands, scarred in ways that told stories she didn't ask about. Mostly, he said. She wanted to say something but chose, instead, to just be there. To sit with him in the silence that had stopped being empty and started being something else. The situation with Crane did not resolve quietly. She had hoped it might. She had thought, perhaps, that the sight of Cale on her property line would be enough. That Crane, a practical man above all, would do the practical arithmetic and decide that a well, however valuable, wasn't worth the cost of going up against a legend. She had underestimated Crane's pride. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday in November when Lily, 11 years old, sharp as a tack and far too brave for her own good, came running back from the north fence line where she'd been checking on the goats and said, breathing hard, that there were men out there. 3 of them, maybe 4, not doing anything yet. Just sitting their horses on the other side of the fence line and watching. Nora sent Lily inside, locked the door, and went to get her rifle. She was standing on her porch with the rifle in her hands, and a very specific sort of calm. The calm of someone who has made peace with what might happen next. When she heard the hoofbeats, she'd know that black horse anywhere now. Cale came down from the bluff without being asked. She would think about this later, about what it meant that he'd seen or heard, or somehow known, and she'd decide it didn't really matter how he'd known, only that he'd come. He rode up to her porch and dismounted and stood beside her. They faced the men at the fence line together, 4 of Crane's riders. Big men, well armed. The kind of men whose entire purpose was to make other people feel small and afraid. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then, one of the riders, the biggest, wearing a hat pulled low against the November wind, shifted in his saddle and looked at Cale with the careful, assessing look of a man who is trying to figure out what kind of trouble he's actually in. Cale looked back at him. Just that, just the look. Those gray, still eyes with their absolute, bottomless quiet. Something happened to the big rider's face. A tightening, a reassessment. He turned his horse around, the others followed. They rode away without a word. Nora breathed for the first time in several minutes. Then she said, "Do you want some coffee?" And he said, "Yes." They went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table, doing her schoolwork with the carefully constructed absorption of a child who is definitely not eavesdropping. She looked up at Cale with the frank, evaluating stare of an 11-year-old who has heard the stories and has also, Nora suspected, formed her own opinions. "Are you the gunslinger?" Lily said. "Lily," Nora said. "It's fine," Cale said, and there was something in the way he said it, the slight roughness that might, if you were listening for it, have been amusement. He looked at Lily. "I was. A long time ago." Lily considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. "Why did you stop?" A pause. "Because it wasn't who I wanted to be. Who do you want to be?" Nora started to intervene again. But Cale raised one hand, not dismissively, just gently, and she let it go. He looked at Lily for a moment, then he said, "I haven't entirely figured that out yet." Lily nodded, apparently finding this satisfactory. "Mama says not knowing what you want to be is okay as long as you know what you don't want to be." She returned to her schoolwork. "Do you want cornbread?" Mama made some. The ghost of the smile appeared again, clearer this time, more itself. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." The confrontation with Crane himself came 2 weeks later. Crane rode up to Nora's gate personally. She'd give him this, he had the physical courage. Whatever else he lacked, with 2 of his men at his shoulders, and that wide, warm smile anchored to his face. He was perhaps 50, thick through the chest. With a prosperous man's good clothes, and a prosperous man's absolute certainty that the world was organized for his benefit, he hadn't expected Cale to be there. He'd come on a Wednesday, not the 1st or the 15th, and Cale was there because he'd been helping Nora fix the north fence, which had been a practical thing that had developed into a regular arrangement that neither of them had formally acknowledged or named. Crane looked at Cale. His smile remained on his face but did something complicated underneath. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, addressing Nora but watching Cale. "I've come to discuss the water rights matter one more time in the spirit of neighborly resolution." "There's nothing to discuss," Nora said. "I've told you my answer." Crane's smile tightened. I think perhaps there are terms we haven't, she said no. Cale's voice was quiet, not aggressive, not loud, just absolutely present, stonewall lawless present. You've had the answer, you have it now. Crane looked at him directly for the first time, making an assessment. I don't believe I know your name, friend. No, Cale agreed. You don't. A long silence in which Crane arrived at a series of conclusions in rapid succession. His men behind him were very still. I see, Crane said. Do you? Cale asked. Another silence. The wind came through, that dry, hot judgment wind off the plain. Crane's smile folded up like something being put away. For the first time, his real face was briefly visible. Not a nice face, but an honest one. A face doing honest arithmetic. He turned his horse around. He never came back. The town noticed, of course. In a community of 240 souls in the middle of nowhere, nobody's business was ever entirely their own. Within a week, everyone knew that Cale had been seen riding the fence line of Nora Calloway's property. Within 2 weeks, everyone knew about the confrontation with Crane's men. Within a month, the whole shape of the thing was visible, at least from the outside, and Dusthaven, to its credit, did what communities sometimes do when the evidence in front of them contradicts the story they've been carrying. It adjusted, slowly, and without quite admitting it was doing so. Tom Ellery at the general store had a brief, normal exchange with Cale about the price of coffee and told 3 people about it in a way that made it sound like an ordinary thing, because it was. Reverend Marsh stopped cataloging Cale's silence as spiritual deficiency and started thinking of it, more accurately, as grief of some kind, which he understood. The mothers still kept their children in on the 1st and the 15th, but they stopped doing it with quite the same edge of terror. More like the way you keep children away from someone who is having a hard time. Not dangerous, just needing space. Sheriff Probst, who had watched the whole business from a careful distance, stopped watching from windows and started occasionally nodding to Cale on the street, which Cale acknowledged with a slight dip of his head that Probst chose to interpret as goodwill. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more complicated and more real than either. A recalibration, a slow revision of the story towards something closer to the truth, which is what good communities do, eventually, if you give them enough evidence and enough time. The first rain came in December. It came the way rain comes after a long drought, tentatively at first as though unsure of its welcome, and then with an abandoned generosity that flooded the dry creek and filled the cisterns and made the whole valley smell like something being reborn. Nora stood on her porch and let it fall on her, and felt a joy so large it was almost indistinguishable from grief, which is often how the deepest joy feels, because it arrives carrying the memory of everything you feared you'd lose. Lily ran out into it immediately, arms spread, face up, laughing. Cale was there. He'd come down to help move some equipment before the weather hit, and he was standing at the edge of the porch watching the rain, and watching Lily running through it. Nora stood beside him. She said after a while, "What happened in the territories?" It wasn't quite a question. She'd never asked before. She was asking now because she thought they'd arrived at a place where the question could be asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There was a family. Homesteaders. A man hired me to move them off land he wanted. I was supposed to." He stopped. "I didn't know there were children until I got there." Another long pause. "I didn't do what I was hired to do." "What did you do?" "I left." He looked at the rain. "I left and I rode north and I kept going until I found a place that felt like it might be possible to stop." A breath. "I don't know what happened to the family after. I've wondered for 15 years. She thought about this. She thought about what it cost to carry something for 15 years. She thought about the kale in the garden and the books on the shelf and the swept floor and the carving. "You stopped," she said. "I stopped. That matters." He looked at her. Those gray eyes. The stillness that wasn't empty anymore, that was. She understood now. Not emptiness at all, but depth. The stillness of someone who had gone far down into themselves and found, at the bottom, something they were afraid to show. "I don't know if it's enough," he said. "It might not be," she said honestly. "It might not cancel out what came before. I don't think that's how it works." She paused. "But it's not nothing." He looked back at the rain. At Lily, still turning circles in the downpour, soaked to the bone and radiant. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." The rain came harder. She didn't move. He didn't move. They stood in the sound of it together. The cold, clean sound of the world being washed, and after a while, the silence between them became the kind of silence that isn't silence at all. That is, in fact, something being said in the only language some people ever learned to trust. Spring came to Dusthaven differently than it had come before. Not objectively, maybe. The same pale flowers along the creek, the same renewal in the pastures after the drought, the same long golden hours of late afternoon that made even ugly things beautiful. Objectively the same, but Nora moved through it differently. Lily moved through it differently, and Cale began, with the careful, tentative quality of a man trying something he'd forgotten how to do, to move through it differently too. He came to town on days that weren't the 1st and the 15th. Not often, not easily, but sometimes. He'd sit in the back corner of the diner that old Marta ran off the main street and have a meal that wasn't beans or tinned peaches, and Marta, who had heard everything and formed her own opinions, would bring him coffee without him asking and refill it without comment, which was her way of saying what words couldn't. He started teaching Lily to carve. This was Lily's idea. She'd seen the piece he was working on. He'd been carving a horse, she found out, the black horse, in a piece of cottonwood, and it was extraordinary, the kind of work that comes from someone who has given their whole attention to something for a long time, and she'd asked if he would show her. He'd looked at her with those gray eyes and said, yes, and thereafter, on certain evenings he would come down from the bluff and sit at Norrie's kitchen table and teach an 11-year-old girl how to see the shape in the wood before you took the knife to it. You have to know what you want before you start, he told her once. If you're not sure, wait until you're sure. Wood doesn't forgive mistakes the way other things do. Lily had looked at him shrewdly over her piece of pine and said, "Is that just about carving?" He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, "No, I thought so," she said, and went back to her work. "There is a day I want to tell you about. It was a Saturday in June, warm and brilliant, the kind of day that seems almost extravagant in its goodness." The creek was running properly for the first time in 2 years, full and cold and clear, and half the town had found a reason to be near it. Children waiting, men repairing the bridge that the drought had weakened, women doing the practical tasks that a running creek made possible again. Nora was there. Lily was there, knee-deep with 3 other children, doing something with rocks that appeared to have elaborate rules. Cale was there. He was sitting on the bank slightly apart from the main gathering, in the way he still instinctively sat apart, but not as far as he once would have been. He was watching the creek with the expression he had when he was somewhere inside himself, and he had the cottonwood horse in his hands, smoothing it with a small piece of sandpaper. The work almost done, Nora sat down beside him. She had a thing she'd been trying to say for several weeks, and hadn't quite gotten to. She was going to say it today, because waiting for the perfect moment was a luxury she'd given up, believing in somewhere around the time Marcus had started coughing. "I want to say something," she said. He looked up. "Lily loves you," she said, "and I." She paused, choosing the words carefully. "I don't know what this is, or what you want it to be, or what's possible. I'm not asking you to know that now, but I want you to know that when I knocked on that door, I thought I was going to ask a stranger to do me a favor, and I didn't get a stranger. He was very still. I got someone," she said. "Someone real, and that matters to me." The creek ran over its stones. Somewhere behind them, Lily's elaborate rock game collapsed into an argument and then into laughter. Cale looked at his hands, at the horse taking shape in the wood, at the small, perfect form of it, emerging from what had been, not long ago, a plain piece of raw material. He said, "When I came here 15 years ago." He stopped, began again. "I didn't think there would be anything after. I thought I'd come here and there'd be walls and silence, and then one day there wouldn't be anything." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. He looked at her. Those gray eyes and all the depth behind them, and all the years, and all the weight of what he'd carried, and at the bottom of all of it, clear and cold and unmistakably present. Something she recognized because she'd seen it before. In Marcus, in Lily, in herself on the mornings when being alive felt like a gift rather than an obligation. Hope, tentative and specific and real. "I don't know what I want it to be either," he said, "but I know I'm glad you knocked on that door." She smiled. It was a full smile, not the careful, measured smile she'd learned to use in hard years, but the one underneath that, the uncalculated one, the one that had Nora Calloway's whole self in it. He looked at the smile. And something in his face, something that had been locked for 15 years, very quietly unlocked. They built things slowly after that. Trust, in people who have been hurt, is built like the stone walls Cale was so fond of. Not quickly, not all at once, but one piece at a time, each piece placed with care, the weight distributed so that no single moment has to carry too much. They had time. They were both in their different ways acquainted with patience. He didn't move down from the bluff, not that year, but he spent more time in the valley. He helped Nora with the well maintenance and the fence line and the 100 small physical repairs that a working property required. He taught Lily to carve and to track animals and to read weather in the sky, things he knew with the specificity of long practice. He ate dinner at their table 2-3 times a week and slowly stopped sitting with the quality of a man who might need to leave at any moment. He began to finish sentences. This sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. He had spent 15 years in sentences that ended early, in conversations that were just logistics, just transaction, just the minimum necessary for survival. Learning to finish a sentence, to follow a thought through to where it actually ended, to say the rest of the thing, was, for Cale, a significant act of faith. He told Nora things, not all at once, not linearly, in pieces the way you tell things to someone you trust. Circling back, going deeper, leaving some doors closed for a while longer. She listened the way she'd listened to him the first morning in his stone house, with the full attention, the real attention that people can feel in their bones. She told him things too, about Marcus, about the fear that she'd grown up with of being ordinary, of being invisible, and how the frontier had been her answer to that fear, and how grief had been the education in what really mattered. About Lily, who was not ordinary in any sense, and who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and who was, Nora thought, going to set the world on fire in the best possible way. Cale listened to all of it. He asked questions. Those short, precise, weight-bearing questions. And he remembered what she said and returned to it days or weeks later, connecting it to something new, showing her that he'd been carrying it, turning it over, thinking about her. Nobody had ever thought about her like that. Not in a long time. The second winter, he came down from the bluff on Christmas Eve. He didn't say he was coming. He arrived at dusk with the cottonwood horse, finished now, polished until it seemed almost to breathe, and he gave it to Lily, who received it with the solemnity of someone who understood what she was holding. Not just the object, but the months of attention it represented. The hands that had shaped it, the intention behind every stroke of the knife, she said. "It looks like yours." "It is mine," he said, "or was. I thought it should be yours." Lily held it carefully, and then did something that surprised all three of them. She put it on the windowsill, where the fading light caught it, and said, "It can live here, where we can all see it." Cale looked at the horse on the sill, looked at Lily, looked at Nora. "Yes," he said. They had Christmas dinner, the three of them. It was just food and warmth and the sound of the wind outside doing its judgment thing against the walls of a house that held it back. And Lily talked too much, and laughed too loud, and fell asleep in her chair before the plates were cleared, and the fire burned down slowly. And at some point, Nora and Cale were sitting in the quiet with the sleeping child between them and the horse on the windowsill, and the dark outside. And there was nothing that needed to be said. And so, nothing was said. And it was enough. It was, in fact, abundant. "I want to tell you what happened to Burrell Crane. He left the valley in the spring. He'd stayed through the winter, too proud to be seen to be driven out, probably, and not entirely without his own form of stubbornness. But come April, he sold his 500 acres to a ranching company out of Denver and was gone before the creek was fully running. Nobody held a celebration. Nobody spat on his shadow as he rode out. That's not how the people of Dust Haven were. But there was a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been in the air for a year, and, after it, the valley felt lighter. Sheriff Probst remarked to Tom Ellery in the general store that the water situation had worked itself out. Tom Ellery agreed that it had. Neither of them mentioned how. "I want to tell you what happened with Cale in the town. It happened slowly and without any single decisive moment, which is the only way it could have happened with a man like Cale. He didn't suddenly become a social creature. He didn't start attending church or playing cards at the saloon, or doing any of the things that would have signaled, in the conventional language of small-town life, that he'd arrived and belonged. What happened was smaller and more durable than that." It was a nod returned, a question answered, a box of nails carried across the street when old Henderson's hands weren't working well. It was Marta's refilled coffee and Reverend Marsh's careful, non-presumptuous nod, and Probst's gradual replacement of surveillance with something that looked, eventually, like the beginnings of respect. It was, in the end, just people making room. Just a community slowly, imperfectly revising its story about a man who had lived among them for 15 years without them really seeing him. He was never entirely easy with people. He probably never would be. Some things leave marks that don't fade entirely, and 15 years of deliberate solitude had done something to the part of him that was built for human contact, not broken it, not destroyed it, but changed its shape. The way a broken bone heals slightly differently than it grew. He needed more quiet than most people. He needed more time between interactions. He needed to know that he could leave if he needed to, but he needed less of those things than he once had. That was enough. That was more than enough. I want to tell you about one more day. It was a Tuesday in the fall, 2 years after Nora first knocked on the black door. Nora was at the well, doing the autumn check of the mechanism, the examination of the pulleys and ropes and stones that Marcus had built, and that she maintained as she maintained everything. Carefully, with respect for the craftsmanship and attention to what needed renewing, she heard hoofbeats and looked up, and it was Cale. He wasn't coming for any specific reason. He came because he was in the valley and he'd thought he'd stop. He did this sometimes now. It had stopped requiring a reason. He dismounted and came to stand beside her and looked at the well in the examining way he had with things, the way of a man who understood how mechanisms worked. "The main rope needs replacing," he said, "before it goes cold." "I know," she said. "I was going to do it tomorrow. I'll help." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She looked at him. He was looking at the well, his hands in his pockets, his face turned away from her slightly, and she could see the gray in his hair and the lines in his face and the large, scarred hands and the way he stood. Straight, still, steady, and she thought about 15 years of loneliness and one morning on a bluff and all the mornings that had come after. And she thought about how the most important stories don't begin the way stories are supposed to begin. They begin with a knock on a door. They begin with someone who is afraid and does the thing anyway. They begin with two people in a room with coffee and an honest conversation and the extraordinary, fragile possibility of starting over. "Cale," she said. He turned and looked at her. Those gray eyes and all the depth in them and the warmth she'd found there and kept finding, clearer every time. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for knocking." The well rope was replaced the next morning, the two of them working together in the crisp fall air. Lily doing her schoolwork at the kitchen table with the window open so she could hear what was said and occasionally offer unsolicited commentary, the black horse and the brown mare standing together in the corral, the cottonwood horse on the windowsill where the light caught it. The wind came through. For once, it didn't feel like a judgment. It felt like a beginning.